Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 38A, an interview on Gerald Ford and the Eye of the Maelstrom with Brooke Clement. I'm excited to welcome Brooke Clement to the show today. Brooke is the director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum in Michigan. To be precise, the library is in Ann Arbor and the museum is in Grand Rapids. And today we're going to take a deeper look at Gerald Ford in the context of his time. The 70s were a period of scandal and political disruption for the GOP as Watergate swirled, and you also had, two sides of the party pulling Ford in different directions, feuding for dominance. The party at the end of the decade looked quite a bit different from the party at the start of the decade. What was it like for Ford to lead in such a moment? That's what we'll discuss. Welcome to the show, Brooke.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be invited.
It's a pleasure to have you. Let's start with what inspired your interest in Gerald Ford?
That's a great question. I'm a true Michigander, so it's always great to fall back on the fact that President Ford was also a Michigander. He's our only Michigan president. And so that's that Michigan pride. He went to the University of Michigan. I am a Michigan alum as well. So,
nice.
He has a special place in my heart for a lot of reasons. So, yeah.
Now, Gerald Ford, he started his political career with a 24-year stint in Congress representing Michigan.
Yes.
What was Ford the congressman like? What were the issues he championed and what were the issues he opposed?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know if you've read Richard Norton Smith's book most recently that he did a biography of President Ford, and he talks about early on as a congressman, Ford was really about the constituency. If somebody wasn't getting their Social Security checks, he was trying to figure out how to make that right. And so he was a constituents congressman. And then later on, and still relatively early on in his tenure there, he kind of took the advice of another congressperson, which he never named as far as I'm aware, that basically said that there's two ways to really be a congressperson. It's you can be the constituents congressperson, or you can learn by being down on the floor and listening to other legislators, trying to get legislation through. Ford decided he wanted to do it that way. Mm-hmm. He had other people that could help him with the constituency, and so he was able to delegate that, and he really leaned into being an active listener and learner on the floor. And he then also was a member of the Appropriations Committee of the House. He was on their Foreign Relations Committee. And so he really thrived, especially in the Appropriations Committee. He really he could talk about a budget like nobody else. So those were the areas that he really focused on. He never wrote legislation, but he was there to support legislation as it came to him and really kind of hammer out the ins and outs of how it would go down. And he I will say he's fiscally conservative. He was the only Republican to be asked to be on the Warren Commission, on the House side.
The House side, yeah.
And so, he was just well respected, well loved. He was a bipartisan. He worked with all members of the House, I would say that was his congressional career, and he really the thing that he most desired was to become Speaker of the House.
Right.
That never happened, but he really loved his time in the House.
Now, I always love to center people because, the parties and politics have shifted so much. So what did the GOP stand for during those decades when he was in the House? And was there much shift? 24 years is a long time for things to change. So did it shift over his tenure?
I think in a nutshell, you've got fiscal conservatism, and then you also have small government. And he was a he was definitely a proponent for, less big government, more small government. And so I think those were the two things that he really would have leaned into. He was obviously very supportive of the military as a veteran himself.
Right.
So those I would say were the things that he leaned into.
In 1965, so between 1 and 2 decades into his tenure there, Ford successfully challenged the incumbent Republican leader to become the House Minority Leader. So I'm curious, what was his pitch for this move? Why ditch the old leader and bring in Ford? How did he get this people behind him?
I think that from what I have gathered and learned is that there really wasn't a pitch on his own part. Like he was a member of what they called the Young Turks, and those were like the Rumsfeld, the Melvin Laird, those new Republicans that had come in. And so they actually went to Ford and suggested that they could potentially get him into that seat. I wouldn't say that he actively was seeking it out, but he wasn't telling them that he wasn't going to take it if they so chose to put him up for it.
Got it.
And in fact, like I read recently that he was out skiing. He was on a family vacation skiing when it came down to like the actual vote. So he, that's how little he actively campaigned for that position.
Well, as a guy who aspired to be a Speaker of the House, it was a good move. If only they'd captured the House, then he would have had it, but
exactly.
he was on his way.
Exactly. It never quite happened.
Okay, so this is basically, it's that World War II generation saying, hey, it's time for our generation to have more power in the House.
Yes.
We're here. Cool.
Yep.
All right, so he's in this new position. He's House Minority Leader of the Republican Party there. Richard Nixon becomes president a few years later in 1969. How did this impact Ford as his party's congressional leader? Because he's still in the minority, but he has his own party in the White House as opposed to the opposition party.
Great question. Ford, because of that, traveled all the time. He was actively campaigning. He was a huge campaigner for other Republicans, in their races that, Nixon really sought out Ford to help in those areas. And Nixon and Ford, they came up through the Congress pretty much at the same time. Nixon started like 2 years ahead of him. So, yeah. I mean, they had a long, really professional and personal relationship. Like they really did. They respected each other. So, yeah.
So in 1973, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned. Why did Nixon turn to Ford? Now you mentioned they've had this strong relationship, but still, it's got to be more than I know the guy to make him vice president. And also, why did Ford say yes, given what a historic joke the vice presidency has been?
So I would say, and I think that everyone would say this, Nixon didn't want Ford to be the vice president. He initially really was hoping that he'd be able to get John Connally into the position. And it wasn't until they really looked at what the confirmation process would be like for a Connally versus a Ford that it was pretty obvious. Like, if you want a smooth sailing confirmation, you're going to go with Ford and you're not going to go with Connally. And in fact, like Ford was confirmed in the Senate 92-3. He was confirmed in the House 387-35. I mean, there was really very little opposition to his nomination for the position. So I think that there is a lot to be said about that. And really, we're in the 50th anniversary year of him being vice president. So that's a very timely question as well. But I will say, like, Ford said yes because he knew he wasn't going to become Speaker of the House. I think that if he was looking, okay, well, I didn't make Speaker of the House, but this would be the penultimate then of my career. I could go out as vice president. He was planning on retiring in 1976 from the House. So he wasn't planning on running again. And so he looked at this like, oh, well, I could finish as a vice president. But he did call the vice presidency the worst job he ever
had. Do we have any sense that he discussed with his friends or allies the possibility that, with Watergate out there, he could become president as a result of this?
I honestly think that he believed Nixon from the get-go, that Nixon had nothing to do with this. This was not going to fall on Nixon when he initially took the position.
Sure.
So I think that he promised Nixon that he wouldn't run in 1976 because Nixon wasn't going to be able to run again in 76 with the 2 terms being completed by then. And Nixon, again, really wanted John Connally to be able to run in 1976.
Oh, wow. How interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So Ford had promised this to him. He's like, I'll finish out as your vice president and I won't oppose a Republican, John Connally ticket. And then I think over time, because Nixon wasn't traveling during that time period in the White House, like he was really being very private. He wasn't taking lots of meetings. Like Ford was the one that was being sent out to travel and kind of push the agenda. And he was constantly being asked about Watergate. And, towards the end of the Nixon presidency, I think Ford really understood like that there were definite, there were things he was saying that were probably not true any longer. And he was really being put into a really, difficult position. Like, do you continue to say that Nixon had nothing and you get swallowed up into Watergate too? Or do you say something and look like you're trying to like become the president? And, it was a no-win situation for him really in that ending, those last few months.
So let's dive deeper into like what that experience was like. You mentioned he's constantly being asked about Watergate, the vice presidency. He's being sent to travel all the time. He's very public facing. Do we have a sense of that internal, how it felt for him? What he was talking to friends, when he talked to his wife, Betty, like what was he saying about this experience?
I mean, I think that they all recognized what a terrible position he was in. I don't think that Betty necessarily wanted to become second lady, nor did she really look to become first lady, but she was going to support her husband regardless. And she was just, she was over the moon that he was actually talking about retirement in 1976. So I think that more so for him is just like the amount of traveling, the amount of stress that he was facing. I don't know that this was a topic that he really engaged in quite a lot outside of work because it was already kind of a contentious, topic of conversation anyway for him. So.
Yeah, I can imagine him like getting away and be like, "Can we just talk about the Michigan football team?
Exactly.
Can we just?" How about those Wolverines?
Exactly.
So Nixon does eventually resign, and Ford does become president. What were the challenges of becoming president in this way through the first ever resignation of your predecessor?
So many issues that could be discussed here. Yeah, Ford was the first president to become president through the 25th Amendment, which is interesting because he was in Congress when the 25th Amendment was passed. And that came to be because of Kennedy's assassination. So there are a lot of, weird coincidences that way, but he became vice president under the auspices of the 25th Amendment. And then he also became president under the 25th Amendment. And no president had ever resigned before. There was no rule book on how to do this. And it unfolded so quickly. Like, Nixon decided on August 8th, noon the very next day, he is out of office, Ford sworn in. But Nixon's, personal belongings and everything are still at the White House.
Right.
So, so they hadn't moved out in that short 12-hour period of time. So, so Ford and his family are still living in Alexandria because they were actually going to be the very first vice presidential family to live at One Observatory Circle. And they were in the process of getting things moved in over there. And then it was like, oh yeah, no, now we're going to be moving to the White House. So he was commuting. He was a commuter early on, like the first, several weeks. He was commuting back and forth between the White House and Alexandria every morning and evening.
Wild.
And then some other things to point out is that, like, he, in that short amount of time, he had to determine, like, who was he going to keep on his staff? Was he going to just completely change the staff over? Was he going to keep some of the Nixon staff that had been there? And he called that, initially he called it the spokes on the wheel kind of staffing. Like he decided that he'd have, like, everybody kind of reporting to him, and it didn't. He recognized pretty early on, like, that wasn't going to work. But but I think too, it's also interesting to note that he was very keenly aware that he was not elected by the people. Like, so when he took office, he was like, I get it, I wasn't elected by your votes, but he did ask us, like, confirm me in your hearts, and pray for me. Like, he really he took that very much into his presidency.
So he gets into his presidency, and he's still being asked about Watergate every day. And a month later, he decides to pardon Nixon. So let's get into why did Ford pardon Nixon, and did he ever regret the decision?
Well, I can say assuredly he did not regret this decision. Okay. He very much felt that was the right decision, and he never wavered. I actually was just listening to a book by Barry Worth, wrote a book called 31 Days, and it kind of talks about the first 31 days of office for him. And it's interesting, like, Watergate was coming up frequently, but it doesn't seem like it was coming up, like, super frequently. Like, it would come up in every press conference. They would ask several questions, but, like, that wasn't the only thing they were asking about. But it was still there. People just weren't letting that go, and he recognized that there was no real good timetable on the indictments and the court case, potential for court cases and things like that. And I think ultimately he worked with, he had his lawyers work with the Department of Justice lawyers and kind of try to figure out, like, what is the best next steps here, recognizing that he needed to get Watergate out from under him. And so he pardoned Nixon. He looked at it as an act of mercy. Nixon was not in great health at that time, so he was looking at it as a compassionate act. It also meant that, we could stop talking about Watergate, or at least what it would mean for Nixon. And he truly felt until he passed away in 2006, like that Nixon was accepting guilt by accepting the pardon.
Sure. And his goal was for, let's stop talking about Watergate, by doing this.
Right.
But I know
and he had a lot of other things on his plate at the time. Like, we're talking about Watergate, but we also have Vietnam War going on. We have inflation and recession happening. And it was just, he wanted to put that to bed and focus on the other things that need to be focused on.
Did it put it to bed? Did people stop asking about Watergate, or did they just start asking new questions and he was like, well, damn it?
No, they started asking new questions. And I think even though he saw it as the act of mercy and he hoped that people would come around and see it as that, people really were concerned that there was a tit for tat or a was there a discussion before Nixon left that
Right.
he would be pardoned if he stepped down, and that did not happen. But I mean, there were discussions, but nothing was ever agreed
Right.
upon in
Right.
advance. And so I think it's interesting because I'm here at the library where his presidential records are. There are thousands upon thousands of letters that the White House received after this decision was made. Pros, cons. My favorite as a kid that said, I think you're half right, you're half wrong. So, I mean, there was an outpouring of discussion, and that we can really kind of attribute to why he lost the 1976 election too. It's like he staked his political career on this decision. He always, but he never wavered. He always felt it was the right call.
You mentioned there were other things happening. There's inflation. There's Vietnam. I'm sure he had his own agenda, stuff he wanted to do. What was his agenda? What did Ford want to do with this opportunity in the White House?
Well, that's an interesting question because most presidents who run and are elected, they actually have an agenda. He was an elected vice president. He never ran on an agenda like that. So I wouldn't say that he necessarily had an agenda in that same vein of like a political agenda. Like, this is what I'm going to do when you elect me and I become president. I think what you see most is that intense desire to heal a nation, get people out from under Watergate, offer amnesty to draft evaders. There was a lot of compassionate and thoughtful practices that would lead to healing in the Ford presidency.
That's a very interesting point because following not just Nixon, but LBJ and Vietnam, there was a lot of that needed back then.
Yeah.
It also strikes me when I look at Ford's presidency and this decade that he's in the middle of, that he's walking a tightrope as the Republican Party still has an active liberal wing. It has an active conservative wing. You have Rockefeller on the left. You have Reagan on the right. How does he manage the challenge of a party that's pulling in opposite directions like that?
I think that's where that congressman's congressman, mentality really comes to play. Like he was a bipartisan through and through. He wanted to reach across the aisle. He wanted to meet people where they could be met and work towards solutions that were mutually beneficial and not just like, well, that, I'm not going to even bother with that. Like he would communicate. He would reach across the aisle where he needed to. So this was no different. What a different Congress back then versus today. That would be your learning of you work together and reconciliate. I believe he's also the president who had the most experience in Congress, if I remember right. His 24 years there is more than any other president. Is this the influence of that congressional career on him? Or are there any other ways where you can look and you can see, man, those years in Congress, it shaped his presidency in this way? Oh, Congress, I think that the way that he was raised, even by his in Grand Rapids, you could recall that too. Like his parents were very mindful about which school they chose for him. So that way he would have a high school career that was not just one thing. And so that he would actually be going to school with minority students or going to school with maybe the less wealthy students in town. And he definitely, he saw that as a kind of a way to like really engage with all sides. And he got to, experience a diverse mindset that way. And then he did that again at the University of Michigan. He took that in. Being in World War II, you're surrounded by others that are not going to necessarily have the same voice or opinion as you. And he was always well loved.
In 1976, He faced a challenge that might have made him feel not well loved. He had a Republican primary challenge from Reagan that
Mm-hmm.
nearly succeeded. So I guess kind of two questions on this. As Ford, the sitting president running for reelection, why did the Reagan challenge to him nearly succeed? But also, what did it take for Ford to fend him off?
Um, that is a really good question. I think that I think again the Watergate thing, the pardon,
Mm-hmm.
that's not to be taken lightly. Those are actions that I mean really did impact his presidential run in 1976. And I think that it wasn't just with the Carter run, it was with Reagan as well.
Yeah.
And definitely and Reagan was definitely running on like I would be new blood. I wouldn't have any of this
Right.
on my background or on my plate.
Yep.
um but ultimately I think that Ford was successful in that particular run because I think that the party was recognizing just the amount of healing that he was accomplishing. That there were good things, like he could rest his hat. Like the economy was slowly rebounding at that point. It wasn't
Sure.
great, but it
Yeah.
wasn't where it was when he started.
Right. Right.
He could lean towards his foreign policies. The fact that he was able to successfully hammer out agreements in Vladivostok and Helsinki with regard to the
Mhm.
Cold War, which ultimately kind of led to the fall of Berlin, the Berlin Wall. So, like,
Yeah.
I think he had a lot going for him in just those 2 short years too, that he could point to and say, "See, I've only just begun."
Absolutely. And after this primary challenge, he then had to do another job at healing. You have to bring the right wing of the party back in. He
Hmm.
had also dropped his vice president had been liberal, and he had dropped his vice president, so he needs to bring the liberal wing of the party back in. Was Ford able to reconcile the GOP around him for the fight against Carter, or was the party still a bit fractured, and was that a factor in the '76 election?
Honestly, I don't think that played that big of a role. Like, I think he was successfully able to rebound from that initial fight. He, I think that what I've heard is that, like, if he had just gone 2 more weeks, like if the election had happened on November 15th or whatever
Yeah,
instead of
yeah,
November 2nd, like if it had just been 2 more weeks, he likely would have won against Carter. Like
yeah.
he really was, coming into that election day, on an upswing. So I don't think that the challenge from Reagan really had that big of an effect on the ultimate ending.
I've got two more Ford questions, and then I got some Betty Ford questions. Because before we got started, listeners, we were talking about how much we love Betty Ford. So we're going to talk some Betty Ford. My last two Gerald Ford questions is what was Ford's lasting impact and legacy on the presidency? And then one more.
I think that we. Oh, there's so many things. I think that you see a lot of familiar faces. Like Ford brought in people, very young people, into his administration and cabinet that played a big role in years to come. Like 40 years later, you'd still hear about Cheney, you still hear about
Right.
Rumsfeld,
Yeah.
and Brent Scowcroft. He really, and Scowcroft started with Nixon, but like still, like these are people that maintained over time, and the fact that Ford saw their
Yeah.
abilities and brought them in, like that says a lot. I think really the lasting legacy for that I keep bringing up is like that idea of healing. He wrote a
Mm-hmm.
book called A Time to Heal. He really wanted people to see
Mm-hmm.
him as a healer, and I think that you really do get that when you see the accomplishments or the accolades that were brought to him after he left office.
Right.
He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was Bill Clinton gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And that all centered around the pardon and then the Profile and Courage Award. Like he was recognized later in life for that act of courage and the fact that it did heal. It wasn't an instant healing, but it was an act of healing.
Yeah, you definitely saw a lot of, even the people who were most angry at the time, decades later, they're like, maybe that was the right move,
Exactly.
as temperatures cooled. And you mentioned earlier, I remember when I was first reading about Ford and I start seeing like the people in his administration, I'm like, these people are all like the George Bush Jr. gang. You're right. Like it's a whole lot of names that all of a sudden are like, wait, I know these people. These are from when I've been alive. Crazy.
Yep.
Wait, last question I got for you. What lessons in leadership can we learn from Ford?
So I think that the lessons in leadership that I would take away from President Ford are, a good leader knows when they are making difficult decisions and they're willing to make that difficult decision. They, even if it's at the detriment of their own personal or professional career. And I think that Ford did that better than most. And it's like, he made the hard decision. Yeah. He let the chips fall where they may, but he never deferred from it either. He felt very strongly that he did the right thing. And it really didn't matter to him if he got the notice later on in life. It was a bonus that people started recognizing it for it, but it wouldn't have changed his mind. And then, he made decisions like the Nixon pardon, granting amnesty, the refugee crisis after the fall of Saigon. He made a lot of decisions that people were not necessarily all for, but he did, he's like ultimately the buck stops here, as Harry Truman would have said. And I'm willing to make these hard choices because I think that they're the right choices and we need to do the right thing here. And so 2020 hindsight, I think, he just showed leadership, a compassionate leadership.
Agreed. Before we go, let's talk some Betty Ford stories, who we were all just agreeing is awesome. Yes. One of the biggest things Betty did when she was in her position in the White House is she publicly discussed a breast cancer diagnosis that she experienced. I was wondering if you can tell me about that moment and, what did society think of and how did people talk of or not talk about breast cancer before? And then what was the impact of this moment?
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. I know that there were other first ladies ahead of her that had similar diagnoses, and they were very private about it.
Right.
Betty Ford was the first public figure in this kind of role that was very open about it. Like, she was not going to shy away from it. I don't think that she necessarily initially thought that it was going to lead to what it did, but not even 2 months into becoming first lady, she had just a routine physical and they found a lump and within a day she was at the Bethesda Medical Center having the biopsy, learning that it was cancer, having the radical mastectomy. And all the while, the White House press office is letting the people know. She wanted the people to know that this was happening. They called it breast cancer. They didn't just say cancer. She was very much like, this was breast cancer. And it's really the first time that word's out there even. And she really destigmatized it in the way that, allowed people to talk about it freely. Being again over here at the library, there's a lot of letters that people sent to her after that diagnosis, after her surgeries. There were women who probably never really spoke about it themselves, but were like, I went through this. here's some exercises that you can do that will help your arms or things like that. Like, I mean, the
That's so
outpouring
sweet.
of support for her in
Yeah.
that way, it's lovely. And like even people sending, not condolences, but letters to President Ford being like, this is how you can support your wife at this time. So, and I mean, it's lovely. And I think that the fact that she was able to do that, like then within a few months, even of her diagnosis, Happy Rockefeller, the second lady, also went through it. And it was just kind of a rolling effect. And it's interesting that like right after she was very public about it, the New York Times did an article and they called it the Betty Ford blip, because her being so public about it actually got so many people going and getting checked that they called it the Betty Ford blip in terms of this outpouring of, making sure that you're getting your routine checks, and maybe because of that, people are getting it, it's getting caught early on. And so she's just an inspiration, and I love her so much.
All right, let's end with, what is your favorite Betty Ford story?
Oh goodness. I think one of the best ones that I'll talk about is the, like right before they left office, she was walking past the cabinet office or cabinet room, and she was with David Kennerly at the time, and she's like, I've always wanted to dance on that table. I mean, and she was a dancer early in life. So like, and Kennerly's like, let's do it. So she actually climbed up onto that cabinet room table and posed and did a little pirouette, and he took photos of it. And I mean, that's just Betty. Like, she was her own person, and she, and I think that's why she was so beloved.
She's a fun person. If you've enjoyed this interview with Brooke and want to learn more about either of the Fords, please consider visiting the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor and the museum in Grand Rapids. She's the director of it all, and it's all open to the public. Thank you for your time, Brooke.
Thank you, Kenny.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show. Thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, we're actually going to take one step backwards for an interview that took some time to line up. Michael Bobellion, author of Battle for the Marble Palace, will discuss the machinations of Tricky Dick Richard Nixon as he attempted to transform the Supreme Court from a liberal bastion to one more of his liking. That's coming up next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.